This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 294. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is FreeBSD and OpenZFS in the quest for technical independence, a storage architect's view.
Yeah, so in this article, we talk about some of the hidden costs of dependency and the principles of building independent storage, right? Open implementation, hardware portability, data portability, and transparency and introspection. And really talk about why you might decide to use FreeBSD and ZFS if you want to build storage that doesn't lock you in.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. A couple of weeks ago, ARM announced their first ever CPU.
Yeah, so ARM has licensed their IP to others to build CPUs, like, your Qualcomm Snapdragons and your Apple M series and so on. But up until now, they've never actually produced their own CPUs. They just built the technology and licensed it to kind of ODMs that would go and make their own product out of it. But now they are making their first actual CPU. What that will mean for companies who normally license the IP and do their own thing is yet to be seen. But this is, I guess, just the next step for ARM.
I mean, it's essentially just another 21st century cash grab, right? Why would we want to play with others when we can just do the whole thing ourselves and not have to share the change around?
Yeah, why don't we cut out the middleman and do a deal directly with the likes of TSMC to fab it for us?
Yeah, I expect in the past it was, it wasn't worth the money to take on the risk to build our own thing when we could just license the technology. But now they've got enough mass that they're able to do that. And of course, it seems they're maybe trying to capitalize on the current situation where they introduced their first ARM-designed data center CPU called the ARM AGI CPU for agentic AI infrastructure.
And they're partnering with Meta, who are going to be the first customer, effectively.
Yeah, and I can see where, looking at the fact that Google and Amazon have built their own ARM CPUs already, and obviously Apple, that Meta didn't want to be left out, but they didn't want to do it all themselves either.
I mean, AGI, though, come on.
Well, especially in this case where they say, well, actually it means agentic, not artificial general intelligence.
Sure it does. And there was never any intent for people to misunderstand what autopilot's function is in Tesla vehicles either.
Yeah. It does seem of note, though, doesn't it? Like, this is, after a very long time, them kind of stepping on the toes of their customers, competing with their customers.
Yeah.
I think, again, this really is just, it's an encapsulation of sort of an overarching theme of the 21st century, which is, elbow everybody else out of the way. It's time for me to get mine. And the other thing that this shows is that ARM has been around for long enough and gotten well established enough to have put together enough of its own capital to start getting that disease of saying, hey, why should I focus on my own core competency where I can most valuably spend each of my personal dollars, in research? Why do that when instead I could just take everything? Why pay somebody else to do the thing I don't care about when I could just do it in a way that shows how little I care, but at the same time, pocket the profit for that piece of the puzzle?
Spec-wise, they're claiming they have up to 136 Neoverse V3 cores per CPU and 6 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth per core at sub 100 nanosecond latency. So those are some pretty big numbers.
You ever wonder at what point a spec sheet like this is showing you somebody's very carefully thought out and expertly engineered plan versus somebody going, put more cannons on the boat, more cannons, more, I say, more. Like, I don't know, maybe that 120 some odd cores is like the exact right amount to get the most benefit, out of the use of the die space. Maybe there is a ton of research that goes into that, but I'm not convinced that there is.
Anthropic exposes Claude Code source by accident.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here has been getting to look a little bit at what's inside, but also people seem to be finding where Claude was sourcing a lot of information and kind of how the scraper is working in some cases. And maybe that will give us better defenses against AI scrapers in the ongoing arms race between people trying to keep their websites up and scrapers trying to ingest the whole internet.
So the mistake that led to this source code being leaked was somebody at Anthropic leaving a map file in a published configuration. Now, map files in this context, they basically expand minified or bundled JavaScript code back into its original, fully human-readable form. Leaving one in a published build can expose some issues like this did, but I think the more interesting takeaway here is what the published map file actually led people to was, you guessed it, a not intended for public consumption asset that was stored in an unprotected S3 bucket. So, we can talk about the nerdiness of leaving a map file in your publish, but that wasn't the real problem. The map file just exposed this unsecured bucket. And if the bucket had been secured in the first place, Anthropic would not have had this problem. So, it's just another one of those, like it feels like it always winds up being one of two or three problems. It's DNS, or somebody left something in an unsecured bucket, or I don't know, Alan, what's the third choice?
Or, especially with this JavaScript stuff where all the authentication is done on the client side.
Yeah, with vibe-coded shit that's got the API keys in the CSS.
Probably not quite that bad, but yeah.
That has happened.
I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm just saying that's probably not one of the more usual cases. That's kind of a novel thing. But, people checking for it on the client side instead of the server side, or just, as Jim said, putting up an S3 with no protection at all are definitely two of the most common things. If you think all the way back to the very early AT&T one with, I think it was the first generation of iPhones, where in order for all the iPhones to get activated and so on, they had a list of all the IMEA numbers or whatever on a thing on their website that was supposed to be hidden and only the people at the stores were supposed to have access, but you could guess the URL of it and then download it all. And then AT&T tried to sue the person for hacking. And they're like, I just went to a URL of my web browser. I didn't hack anything. I didn't brute force anything. I just went to a URL that you didn't secure. I'm not the hacker. You're the incompetent.
Now, we are recording this a week earlier than we normally would, so this story may well have developed by the time you're listening to this. But Anthropic have decided to go after everyone who started sharing this source code on GitHub and forking it. And, it's been a real case of whack-a-mole. And, they're using the DMCA takedowns and everything for that, which is somewhat ironic that they're using copyright law to try and stop people spreading this source code, given that they built the plagiarism machine, essentially.
Yeah, that's definitely got some pretty startling degrees of hypocrisy in there.
But what I'm also seeing from people who've looked through the code is that it's like really bad. It was vibe coded essentially by itself.
By earlier, worse versions of itself.
Well, yeah. And it just real, as Jim would say, romper room errors in it and stuff. And just proper hacks upon hacks upon hacks. It really doesn't make them look very good.
It's interesting as we talk about these errors, whether we talk about how initially it seems really technical, there was a leaked map file. And what does that mean? It means somebody left some crap in an S3 bucket again. How everything just always seems to reduce down to this handful of common errors. And you can further reduce that handful of common errors basically down to negligence. I'm not sure how useful it is to reduce the entire set of issues and problems and badly designed code in the IT industry to negligence, but you can. That's really what it all comes down to. Are you using AI to vibe code your software and therefore it sucks? Well, that was pretty negligent of you, wasn't it? Did you leave a map file in your build and that, led people some breadcrumbs to explore interesting things you wish they hadn't? That was negligent of you. Did you have stuff in an unsecured S3 bucket? Well, again, it's not that, you didn't know better or nobody had ever made that mistake before. You had to violate, a well-known industry standard. I wouldn't even say best practice, just moderate practice in order to do that. So what is the takeaway when we reduce every single problem in our field down to people are lazy?
As we always say, security is a trade-off between usability and security. And we seem to oftentimes get people pushing back so hard on the lack of usability that they end up with no security. People say, well, I want other people to be able to access it, but only certain other people. But I don't want to make them have, usernames and passwords for it or something. So I will just depend on people not being able to guess the URL, except for then I posted the URL somewhere and now everybody knows it.
I think the trade-off between usability and security, that's one of those, I like to call it a metronome type pattern. It's not a nice, simple sine wave or, a circle that just kind of goes in one direction smoothly. These metronome type patterns, they keep going until they've gone too far, and then they bounce off of the hard stop at the end,
And go too far back the other way.
Exactly. It's not that nobody ever thoughtfully, carefully, quietly adjusts a slider in a more sensible direction between usability and security, but that seems to very rarely be how those changes actually get made. It seems like it usually winds up, being a purity test where, things need to be more secure and more secure and more secure until the users all rebel and you have passwords on sticky notes, on the actual display surface of the monitor. All of these various workarounds that boil down to fuck you, we opt for no security instead of your nonsense. Until that causes enough of a problem that then you bounce off of that hard stop and you start again with the purity tests, leading you back towards an unusable degree of security.
But as for this everyone being incredibly lazy thing, I mean, how can I ask this nicer, Jim? But you're getting on a bit. Have you noticed a sort of trend over the years of people getting lazier and lazier, wanting things as quickly as possible, wanting to cut corners, or has that just been ever thus?
I think that is, again, something that's very cyclical. I think that human society tends to bounce back and forth between we're willing to spend more in order to do things right versus, doing things right is for chumps and losers, and we're looking to make as much as we can as quickly as we can off of whatever we're doing. And that's another one of those metronomic type patterns. It tends to bounce back and forth. And I think we're pretty close to as far as we can go on the let's just cheap out on absolutely everything phase of that cycle.
Yeah, I think the other part of it is we've seen some better UI and UX before and gotten to the point where people expect it to be as easy as this other thing, even when that other thing maybe is not actually that related, and causes some weirdness when people want something to be easier than it can be. Or, they want the computer to just figure it out instead of having some positive security control of some kind.
That's the real clarion call behind all of this AI shit, right? Is just let the computer figure it out. I don't want to have to think about this. Let the computer worry about it, not me.
Yeah, I want to make an application. I've got this idea for this software. I don't want to have to learn how to write the code. I want to just tell the computer to do it.
But the thing about that is you didn't make a thing. You didn't actually make it. It's one thing to say, I don't want to learn this particular programming language. I don't want to learn this particular development environment. You can say, well, I want to write a program, but I don't want to learn a new language to do it. You can even say, I want to write this program in this antique development environment that I happen to be very familiar with and comfortable with. And then once I have created a well-defined, no kidding, actually fully fleshed program, maybe I would even like an AI agent's assistance in porting that to a different platform. You've still built a thing at this point, but when you skip the part where you actually built the thing, well, you didn't build the thing. You have an idea. It's not fully fleshed out. And the thing that you didn't do isn't just not learning a specific language. You didn't actually flesh your idea out at all. You just turned it over to the bot.
Well, there are those who would argue that if you go through and create a proper spec for the software, then you kind of have thought it through. Not to the extent of writing it in a different language than you want to end up with, but I think there is a difference between just make me a website, proper vibe coding, and people who spend more time and have at least some understanding of what they want the AI to do for them. I'm not saying that the result is necessarily going to be very good, but I think there is a distinction there.
I'm saying that the actual work is not in learning a particular programming language or development environment. The actual work is in fully specifying your idea and actually getting all the things that matter down, not just as a vibe, but like literally, this is the detail of how this should work. That's the hard part. And that's the part that people overwhelmingly want to avoid having to do for themselves. It's easy to dress that up as I don't want to learn PHP or JavaScript or whatever, but what people really don't want to do is the hard work of figuring out every single thing about how every moving part of an interaction with a machine actually works. That's a lot of freaking work, whether you learn one single line of any actual programming language or not.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Wouter writes, my friend wants to back up the photos from their Pixel 9a phone, but doesn't want to give them to Google. Setting up a self-hosted image is outside of their expertise. I have an old Synology that the website says is still supported that I could give them, or I could build them a low-end NAS and throw TrueNAS on it. The budget would be about £100. What would you recommend?
I would actually probably recommend TrueNAS here, given that the primary application is not just generic file storage, but is specifically photo storage. Going with TrueNAS is going to give you more options down the line to get a little fancier with what you're doing. Whereas if you're just throwing it all on a Synology, well, you're basically just getting basic file sharing, and that's pretty much all it's going to be regardless.
Well, Synology does have some apps, but you kind of then tied into the Synology ecosystem. Whereas if you go for something open source like Image, then there is much more portability later on, potentially.
Yeah, and with, you can use TrueNAS as a base to host an image VM. Not that Alan or I typically recommend diving into TrueNAS specifically with the goal of running virtual machines, but in this particular case, it doesn't seem like there really is an option that's going to make Alan or I super happy with our usual recommendations, but we have to tailor our recommendations to what people are looking for. And in this case, when the choice is some old Synology I found lying around the website says it's still supported, or I can throw together a box and put TrueNAS on it, I would go with TrueNAS.
Yeah, so with TrueNAS in their app ecosystem, the image would actually be a Docker container on the base TrueNAS. So it's separate from the TrueNAS and can't muck up the TrueNAS, but it also means if in the future you wanted to move it somewhere, you could actually be able to pick up that Docker container and move it somewhere else or just, extract or back up the image database and move it to another machine or something. So if you outgrow the TrueNAS and decide you want to do your own thing with Ubuntu because you've skilled up or something, you would be able to easily do that. Whereas that is really not the case with the Synology.
Yeah, you're just completely locked into their applications and ecosystem, really.
Yeah, whereas the apps, as they're called generally on the TrueNAS, are just Docker containers of open source applications. They have a nice one for setting up a WireGuard host or lots of popular media things, and even the right stuff to be able to pass through hardware if you need to.
You really have to work at it and have some serious skill in the game to be able to build a lower powered NAS than the Synology purpose-built hardware out there. That's not really a dig on Synology themselves as a company. It's just that's the way dedicated hardware NASs are built. Whether it's Synology or whether it's Netgear's Ready NAS, you're going to be looking at the bare minimum of CPU and RAM necessary to get things going, which again is not a good fit if you think you might want to get into more advanced, application-based stuff like running, image or any other kind of photo gallery, application on the back end.
Yeah, and for those off-the-shelf NASs at a big box store, it's all about, can we be $15 cheaper than the competition? And so you get absolute bare minimum, the lowest spec of everything. Whereas even for £100, the TrueNAS machines you could build is probably both higher spec, but also more expandable in the future.
Yeah, so as for hardware, I would recommend, if you're on a serious budget, looking on eBay for either an Optiplex or maybe an HP 290, or if you want to go even more budget, a Fujitsu S Primo. But they're kind of shit tier, but they're still all right. And specifically, you want to look for Mini Tower or MT if you want to put a couple of disks in it as well as your operating system SSD. If you go for the small form factor, you're going to really struggle to get more than one 3.5-inch disk in there.
Yeah, and then most of the time, space is not really the limiting factor. And often you can get more hardware for less money if it is bigger. Miniaturizing everything costs more. So a more expandable machine is often cheaper for the same hardware or same specs.
Except not actually in this case, because of the repurposing them for the use of a NAS, the small form factor ones tend to be a little bit cheaper than the mini towers actually. But he's not talking much. I think for your £100 budget, you could get something like maybe 6th, 7th gen i5 or whatever, probably not an 8th gen i5 because they can run Windows 11.
Sure, but that's still newer than half the machines in my house.
You'd be surprised about the 8th and 9th gen Intel stuff. I find it's usually more just a case of if it happens to be available at a decent price right at the moment, but surprisingly frequently, I find 8th gen stuff that, yes, you can install Windows 11 on, selling for the same cut rate price as, the 6th gen stuff that you can't.
Right. Well, watch out for sellers trying to sell it bare bones, though, with no RAM.
Yeah.
Because they've stripped it out.
You do not want to have to add RAM to a build these days. You definitely want to be paying that, oh, well, I hadn't really stopped to think about the individual value of the parts in my build kind of a price, for a used machine. Because even DDR3 is ridiculously expensive right now.
Yeah. So what do we think? 8 gig minimum for true NAS?
Yes, definitely. And I would try real hard to get to 16.
Yeah, especially if you're going to be running a bunch of the kind of apps on top of it in Docker containers. It's not like a VM where it's going to steal a bunch of the RAM, but it's still, if you're going to be running a bunch of extra services on it, the extra RAM will help.
Yeah, you might struggle at the kind of £100 range to get 16.
But it would be enough for especially if the primary use of this is just backing up photos, it doesn't have to be that fast.
Yeah.
At 100, you might struggle, but I have no trouble whatsoever coming up with 16 gigs worth of 6th gen Intel Optiplex for $184 on Amazon, not even having to go to eBay.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.